Hello, Jack here. So, many years ago, I called into a radio station in order to tell a transgender-related story. I had a weirdly specific bucket list item where I wanted to talk about being trans on the radio at some point for some reason, and they had given me a perfect excuse to call in. The DJ had asked for people to call in who had been in either bad or abusive relationships and explain why they stayed in those relationships as long as they did. Now, I gotta say I do not believe that is a good question to ask on a radio station, and that factored into my lifelong disdain for radio DJs, but I had in fact stayed in a bad relationship for quite a long time, and it was specifically related to me being trans, so I called in. So this was a long-term, long-distance relationship that had started with a cis boy when I was in my early to mid-teens. It wasn't a good relationship, and it actually never had been a good relationship. I wouldn't say that he was abusive, but we were both kids, and it was pretty mutually toxic because we were both really immature and indoctrinated into a lot of casual heteronormative nonsense. So when I went to college, I decided to transition and predictably came out to him pretty early on in that process. And he said that he would love me anyway because he loved me as a person. And that relationship dragged on a while. And during that time, he just got increasingly antagonistic about it. Far from actually just loving me as a person regardless of gender, he refused to acknowledge me as a man at all, and he constantly misgendered me, and he suddenly felt the need to just talk lovingly about my boobs at any occasion that he could find the excuse to do so, eventually agreeing to stop doing so in front of me, but explaining that he would continue to talk approvingly about my boobs with his friends because, he just loves my boobs so much, right? Just to remind you, this part of your body that you have explicitly said that you intend to get rid of, I just love it. And I love it enough to tell all of my friends how much I love it, and I refuse to ever stop doing so. And it's very clear in retrospect, of course, that if I had begun to physically transition during that relationship, he would have taken it really poorly. But because it would be years before I would get to that point, we were in this situation where he could tell me that he loved me regardless of my gender, but in reality he was just still able to view me as a girl who had short hair and wore boy clothes and had a weird temporary desire to be a boy. And I tolerated that for quite a long time, believing that, he'll eventually come around because he loves me as a person. And he'd said so himself on so many occasions. Meanwhile, of course, he also presumably thought that I would eventually come around and decide not to transition. And I was stressed and really miserable in that relationship, and he probably was too. So why didn't I leave? I explained on the radio that the reason I stayed as long as I did stay was pretty simple and really quite depressing. I didn't think that anybody else would ever love me. I was very unpopular in school, and even as a girl, I felt like I was just the luckiest person in the world to have found the one person on Earth who could possibly ever love such an unfathomably horrible monster as myself. And then, when I decided to transition, my self-concept shifted from the luckiest girl in the world to the luckiest trans guy in the world, because I had a partner who stayed. And in spite of doing this thing that would obviously make me just an undesirable pariah for the rest of my life to anybody else except for this one boy that I met when I was 14 or 15 years old. I didn't know any other trans people at the time. My basis of comparison was movies from the 80s and 90s in which dating a trans person and being disgusted or angry by it were a common punchline. And the main movie about a trans man in particular getting into a relationship ended with his brutal murder. So I had internalized this idea that being with somebody, anybody, who didn't vomit in disgust or murder me meant that I was incredibly lucky to have them. I eventually did break up with him, but it took a long time to accept that things just weren't going to get any better in that relationship. I had to accept that not everybody can just up and adapt their sexual orientation because their partner transitions, and I also had to accept that I never actually was an unfathomably horrible monster that was lucky to be in a relationship with literally anybody. And I deserved to be with somebody who accepted me as I was, not who they wished I was. I tell you this story because this sort of scenario is extremely common in the stories that I read on trans male forums. I see posts from people who are dealing with a spouse or other partner, usually a cis man, although not always, and they post asking if their partners will ever learn to see them as men, or more appropriately, when they will finally see them as men. And when they detail the things that happen in these relationships, they're so similar to what I went through. Things like refusal to use the right name and pronouns, taking any opportunity to talk approvingly about their partner's breasts or vagina, and talking nonstop about how much they don't want to be with somebody who has a beard or more body hair, and making so-called compromises that basically amount to saying, oh, yeah, you can identify as trans and call yourself a boy if you want to, but you can't actually transition, though. And the people posting these horrible stories often seem to be looking for confirmation that that relationship will last. Reassurance that, of course, their partners will eventually come around, that, of course, their love will conquer this obstacle, and of course their partner will eventually realize that they have a bi side they weren't aware of, and that maybe they can make an exception just this once, just because they are just so in love with you as an individual human being that maybe it won't matter if you transition. And here's my 100% no bullshit response. I cannot stress enough here that the vast majority of the time, if you were to ask me about any of these relationships, my honest to God's answer is dump him. And yeah, I'm using that vernacular because it's funny and allows me to make a sign for my cover graphic, but this is not actually to be mean. This kind of relationship is not good for either of you. It's just up to one of you to take the initiative and actually do it. And no, this is not universal advice for every single trans person who comes out while they're already in a relationship. Some people do really just adapt to their partner coming out as trans, or realize they were more flexible with their relationship preferences than they thought they were. And in these cases, yes, it's normal to slip up on pronouns and names for a while, or to have to go through an adjustment period. That doesn't inherently portend relationship doom, and like many trans people, I love to see it when it happens. I'm very happy for people who can preserve relationships through transition, but when your partner starts constantly talking about your boobs when they'd never talked about them with any real frequency before, or if they say that they support your transition but only if you agree not to go through anything physical, if they're constantly belittling your transition and then playing it off as a joke when they know damn well you don't find it funny, if they're saying things like, I'll always love you, but you'll always be my girlfriend Jackie to me, if they're just overall asking you to compromise on things you know you ultimately can't compromise on forever, that's not somebody who's struggling to adapt. That's somebody who is passive-aggressively giving you an ultimatum. This is somebody who is trying to either get you to change your mind about transitioning, or get you to end the relationship so that they don't have to shoulder the responsibility of doing it themselves. I'm not here to defend cis people being jerks to their newly out trans partners, but having been in a train wreck relationship like this, my boyfriend didn't sign up for a same-sex relationship. He was, as far as I can tell, not really interested in men, and so it would have been perfectly appropriate for him to break up with me when I made it clear transition was absolutely happening for really real. Yes, we both loved each other, but love is not conversion therapy, and it should not be controversial to state this. To use a less controversial analogy, if a man is dating a woman and he finds out during the relationship that he's actually gay, do we treat him like he's shallow or bigoted if he breaks up with her? No, we might rightfully feel bad for a woman who gets dumped because her boyfriend turned out to be gay, sure, but it's nonetheless best for both of them not to be in a relationship like that. I don't think people really register how much this same thing transfers to transgender relationships. Somebody whose partner is imminently transitioning to a gender they aren't into may very well not want to be the guy who breaks up with a trans person, so they may be a different kind of bad guy and behave in ways they know will make you break up with them instead. So do it! Dump him! Rip off the band-aid. Do not do what I did and let a shitty relationship linger for months and months because you hope that your partner discovers his heretofore unknown bisexual side. I know that people make complicated decisions when it comes to relationships, especially if they're trans, and if you decide, no, Jack, you're wrong, I just know that this relationship has a chance, for whatever reason, it is absolutely your prerogative to keep trucking on forward if that's what you think suits you. I don't know your individual relationship, and I don't know what's all at stake for you in particular, but you know, a lot of these posts that I've been talking about have follow-ups, and the prognosis for a relationship like this just is not good. And having been in a situation like this myself, the years that I spent as a single trans person looking for a partner have all been exponentially better than the months that I spent trying to salvage my failing relationship with an increasingly irritable straight guy. So you don't have to take my advice. But let it be known, if you were asking me personally for advice on a similar situation, that advice virtually always is going to be the same. Dump him! I don't even have a closing for this. I didn't write one. I looked down and I realized that I forgot to write one. Probably because I feel like I already made my point multiple times here. The point, dump him, happy trails.